venture to also suggest such of those of you who have not had the opportunity yet to please have a look at the documentation that you have in your folders, and there you will find an interview given by Dr. Hans Blakes, the former Director General of the IAEA, and there's another one on Iran's nuclear program and the legal mandates of the IAEA. Both of these are very relevant to not only what Admiral Shankar has just said, but also what I do imagine that Arun Vishwanathan is going to say now. So may I please call upon him to give his presentation. Thank you.
Siddhartha. Let me begin by thanking Professor Ramamurthy and Professor Rajaram and Professor Chandrasekhar for giving me this opportunity to speak here. As you see, I'll be giving an overview on the Iranian nuclear program, and I'll not be touching on the technical aspects because that is something which Dr. Krishnan will be doing in his presentation. The outline of the presentation is something like this. Begin with the current status of the P5+1 negotiations, then go on to a theoretical listing as to what drives nuclear proliferation, and from there a brief history of the Iranian nuclear program, the main drivers as to the program, and what do these drivers tell us about Iran and how the course the program will take. The Iran and the IAEA, and how the IAEA has also seen a shift from playing Robin Hood during the Atoms for Peace to an inspector, role of an inspector, to now one possibly of a politician. Then a nuclear Iran, how will it behave? Most of the literature floating around is talking more of whether Iran will go nuclear, how quickly will it go nuclear, etc. But I'll want to look at it a little differently. Whether Iran, if it goes nuclear, how will it behave? Will it behave any differently from other states? Then catch-22 that Iran finds itself in will be the last sort of thing in my presentation. Beginning with the current status of the P5+1 negotiations, been talked about by former speakers also. But as we know, in Baghdad, the P5+1 and Iran and the negotiator Saeed Jalili had met in the much fortified green zone, but they did not succeed in making much progress. However, the parties have agreed to meet again on June 18th, somewhere in mid-June in Moscow, for another round of negotiations. This would be the third series of meetings since Istanbul in April, when they met after that ended a 15-month hiatus in talks. Now, the West has wanted, as we have known, that they want Iran to halt a production which they claim has reached 20% of uranium enrichment, ship this stockpile abroad, and eventually shut down the new enrichment plant at Fordo near Qom. In return, unlike what Iran would have expected, there was nothing which was put on table regarding immediate relief from any economic sanctions, and neither was there any sort of reconsideration which was promised for EU embargo, which was also spoken about by Admiral Shankar. Now, the Iranian negotiator apparently ran circles around the P5+1, and it's supposed that he made a 5-point proposal, but he did not make any kind of written proposal during this. One was about he could have promised a fatwa from the supreme leader declaring nuclear weapons forbidden under Islam, but no mention of how this would be operationalized. Second, recognition of the Iranian right to enrich uranium under the NPT, which Iran claims is a right it has under the NPT. Second, discussion of regional issues like Syria and Bahrain, which was outrightly rejected by the P5+1, that this is not a forum for negotiating discussing any such issue. Then some kind of positive movement in the West in return for Iran agreeing to enter into an agreement with the IAEA on inspections. With the IAEA, Iran sort of only agreed that it would discuss further, meet further and on inspection. It did not enter into any sort of agreement, unlike what was said in a lot of the media reports. And probably Jalili wanted to go to Baghdad with a sort of a bargaining chip in hand, So that could be one reason why the DG-IAEA went just prior to this meeting in Baghdad. And also discuss the enrichment up to 20%, but this would also be an open-ended sort of a discussion without any details as to if Iran would actually suspend enrichment and what would it demand in return if it did so. So despite the positive movement which was noted, that I wouldn't sort of describe it as a breakthrough between Iran and IAEA following the DG Yuki Amano's visit to Tehran. There is an anxiety which is quite palpable among all states in the issue as to if there is no progress which is seen and no progress is achieved in the Moscow meeting, as to what will be the future of this given Israel's drum war beating that it would like to bomb Iran. Now what drives nuclear proliferation? I'll just go through this quickly. You can either focus on the demand side, which is the state's willingness to acquire nuclear weapons, which is sort of fashioned by the security challenges it faces. It could acquire nuclear weapons if many countries have to deter external aggression. It either domestic political lobbies, coalitions and their associated economic development strategies could be another sort of factor which drives proliferation. In the international norms of prestige associated with nuclear weapons could be another factor. Or individual psychological or personality could also drive nuclear proliferation or states' acquisition of nuclear weapons. Another could be the opportunity to acquire nuclear weapons. This in essence means that a state's desire is one thing, but does it have the technology, resources and expertise to build nuclear weapons, to procure nuclear weapons? So it does not matter whether the state wants to acquire it, but if it is unable to sort of muster these elements, it cannot do so. In any of these, there will be a combination of varying degrees, which any of these factors will come together and drive a nation pursuit of sort of proliferation. I also wanted to sort of point out this thing was, when you're examining nuclear proliferation as general rule of the thumb, the spread of nuclear weapons is more threatening to relatively powerful states than it is to relatively weak ones. The state supply of sensitive nuclear resistance to other states is influenced by largely three strategic conditions. One could be the more powerful state is relative, the more the state is powerful to the recipient, the less likely it is likely to provide such assistance. States are more likely to provide such assistance to countries which they share a common enemy with. And thirdly, states which are less vulnerable to superpower pressure are more likely to provide such assistance. I'll move on to the brief history of the Iranian nuclear program. As we noted, it had a rather large nuclear program under Shah Pahlavi. In 1974, it signed several contracts with the US for supply of 6 reactors, West Germany 2, France 5, along with the arrangements to supply light enriched uranium to fuel these reactors, with investing in Eurodif and other long-term supply contracts with France, West Germany and the US. They also envisioned to have a complete nuclear fuel cycle, for which Iran negotiated for acquisition of plutonium reprocessing technologies from the West Germany and some hot cells separation of PU from the US. Now, when interestingly this ambition to achieve full fuel cycle was something of a roadblock when the US and Iran was negotiating their peaceful nuclear cooperation arrangement in 1976. Interestingly, the Tehran research reactor, which is under a lot of controversy, was supplied by the US in 1967 when it began functioning, and subsequently Iran entered into an agreement with Argentina to supply a new core fueled by uranium enriched up to 20%. Now, during this time, they also entered into expanding their civilian nuclear program to 1300 megawatt nuclear reactors from Siemens, another one which was to be supplied by France. In this point of time, there were certain statements by Shah regarding Iran taking the option of producing nuclear weapons. In 1974, he made the first statement, and similar statement was made in February 1975. But all this came to an abrupt halt in following the 1979 Islamic Revolution. And this could be one of the drivers which sort of influences Iran's progress in the current scenario. Another important driver is the 8-year-long Iran-Iraq war, which definitely left a very deep impression in the Iranian psyche, and it greatly influences this pursuit of nuclear weapons today. During the course of this war, burdened with the US-led arms embargo and facing chemical weapon and Scud-type missile attacks from Iraq, Iranian leaders definitely realized the need for a strong deterrent. The Iran-Iraq war taught the Iranians a valuable lesson about the importance of having a credible deterrent force of its own. Iran during this crisis had none, and they were extremely vulnerable as a result of this. In October 1988, drawing upon the experience of the Iran-Iraq war, the then Speaker of Iran's Parliament, or Majlis as it's known, Hashemi Rafsanjani, spoke to the IRGC and called for the development of nuclear and other unconventional weapons. He is supposed to have said the importance of such weapons was made very clear during the war. We should fully equip ourselves both in the offensive and defensive use of chemical, biological and radiological weapons. Though he subsequently rejected nuclear weapons on many occasions, as have other leaders, calling it a completely anti-Islamic, Rafsanjani's statements captured the impact that the Iran-Iraq war had on the Iranian nuclear program and its pursuit of nuclear weapons. So next, what do these drivers tell us about Iran? On the demand side, as seen from the brief history that I just sort of outlined, there are several security challenges in the Iranian history which design Iran's security paradigm. Israel's possession of nuclear weapons, Iran's relations with the US, and the difference in treatment meted out to North Korea and Libya will definitely and have definitely factored how Iran perceives the threats to its security, and as a result the possible benefits of possessing nuclear weapons. Another factor could be the domestic strong lobbies possibly led by the IRGC, which could be expected to push for a nuclear deterrent. However, I would like to state that such a push would definitely be tempered by statements including from the Supreme Leader, which state that nuclear weapons are anti-Islamic. It is quite interesting to also note that it doesn't seem that the Iranian leadership still has taken the political decision to produce nuclear weapons. Producing nuclear weapons at the end of the day is a political decision. The politicians or the political leadership have to make a decision that after this, please go ahead and produce nuclear weapons. You can sort of achieve what is called the breakout capability, but the decision in essence has to be a political one. And this sentiment was recently echoed by the IDF chief, Lieutenant General Benny Gantz, in an interview to Haaretz. He opined that in his opinion, Iran has, the leadership, including the Supreme Leader, has not sort of taken the political decision to produce nuclear weapons. And despite all his bluster about wiping off Israel off the world map, denying Holocaust, the Iranian president could be seen as a more flexible than others in the Iranian regime, the hardliners. And the fuel swap deal, which he sort of was involved in this, but he could not carry this through because of opposition from the Majlis, the hardline clerics. It became very clear that he could be one of the more flexible in the Iranian establishment. Thus, all this sort of proves that Iran is not speaking in one voice as far as the decision to produce nuclear weapon goes. However, the initiation of a conflict by the US or a strike by Israel could change all that. All these parties could sort of coalesce and come together as a result of any of this. The supply side, as I mentioned, will not touch too much. Dr. Krishnan will talk about this during his presentation. However, in my opinion, it does seem that Iran has the technology, resources and expertise to build nuclear weapons. The decision to do so is different. Interestingly, also the Israelis too are not speaking in one voice like the Iranians. They do realize that there is a window of opportunity which is rapidly closing for them. The bombing option pushed for by PM Netanyahu has been publicly described by Meir Dagan, who was till recently the Mossad chief, as the stupidest idea he's ever heard. So the Israelis too are not sort of very clear, and they're not sort of that the only option to stop Iran would be the bombing option. Thus, despite its security concerns and technical know-how, the Iranian leadership seems to be vacillating on the actual decision to go ahead with the production of nuclear weapons. It is, however, sort of widely accepted that Iran is most likely inching towards a breakout capability. One could sort of distinguish whether Iran would choose to break out or sneak out, though such decisions would have their own set of problems. Iran, in all likelihood, would develop a capability to produce a weapon, and unless someone like Israel, in case it carries out the bombing, does something very stupid, it is unlikely to reach its tipping point. Now I'll come to the Iran and the IAEA. There has been a noticeable shift in the IAEA's role over years, or the past, since its inception. It has gone from playing atomic Robin Hood, where it encouraged developed countries to share their technology under the Atom for Peace, to playing a sheriff role, where it's more emphasis on enhanced inspection, safeguard regimes, and policing civilian nuclear programs, to a new phase where it's dawning now, where it's playing a more political role. And as brought out by Admiral Shankar, this role was very clearly seen in the November 2011 report of the IAEA, where the agency released, in quotes, evidence about Iran's weapons-related activities. Now, what I would like to highlight is that this indicates a shift in the manner in which the IAEA, uses intelligence which is shared by member states with it. In the past, what the agency did was that it welcomed this intelligence but did not espouse it. It did not make itself, the intelligence, its own. Now, the November report, in my opinion, marks a shift in this, because the agency has compared this intelligence provided largely by the US and some other countries with the information which it already had from safeguards inspection in Iran and the information gleaned from the AQCON network. Now, what the agency seems to have done is it's put out this in the annex on the November 11, highlighting the Iranian activities that are relevant for the development of a weapon and relevant for nothing but producing a weapon. So, the two sort of distinctions it has made. And by doing this, the agency seems to be stating that there is an overall picture of credibility, and it is sort of backing this, putting it out in its own report to the BOG and the Security Council, and added that this is something which this is a new intelligence it has provided. However, if one reads the report, there is very little which is new in this. Most of which is put out in the report is already been, which is known from the past. Secondly, it's most of this intelligence is something which has been gathered from the infamous laptop of death, which apparently the US provided to the IAEA. And this is something which still arouses suspicions as it had in 2005. Now, given that the agency's history of being burned due to suspect intelligence in the past, as was seen in the Iraqi import of uranium oxide from Niger, and even the earlier in 1993-94, when the agency was provided information of the Iraqi nuclear program, which also turned out to be false or forged, it could be in the IAEA's interest to tread very carefully when it is donning this new role. Nuclear Iran, how will it behave? Now, much of the warmongering which has been going on, led by Israel, is premised on the fact that Iran is an irrational actor, one which cannot be predicted, and nuclear weapons in the hands of such an actor would be very dangerous. However, Iran has been described by several top Israeli generals and intelligence officials as being a rational actor in its own way. It's not rational as how Israel sees it, or is how Israel perceives rationality, but in its own way it is rational. Despite this bluster towards Israel, Iran has shown no recklessness in its foreign policy. One. In fact, the last time Iran used force against a neighbor was over 200 years ago, in 1803, I believe. We sort of attacked Georgia. In fact, former Mossad chiefs have even stated that if Iran were to acquire few nuclear weapons, Israel would not face any additional or significant threat to its existence. The Iranian restraint, another point which I'd like to make, is the Iranian restraint in its actions in the Strait of Hormuz during the 1980-88 Iran-Iraq war is another case in point which points to the rational actor, Iran being a rational actor. It realized that closing the strait would be the military equivalent of cutting off its nose to spite its face. Therefore, it exercised restraint by attacking shipping primarily in the Western Gulf, closer to the Shatt al-Arab. Iran laid mines only in the UAE waters, and that too not in large numbers. Iran's activity in and around the strait were confined to intrusive ship boardings and inspections of cargo bound for Iraq. Later in the war, Iran, despite installing anti-ship cruise missile batteries at several locations facing the strait, never fired them at the traffic in the area. This did not happen even after the accidental shooting down of the Iranian passenger airline in 1988 by USS Venice. Now, the above paints a picture of Iran being quite a rational actor, and this image is diametrically opposite to the one which is being portrayed in the popular imagination by the Western media. This would therefore mean that Iran would understand and appreciate the fact that the use of its nuclear weapons when it procures them under any situation would be suicidal. Thus, given the manner in which it has shaped and implemented its military and foreign policy, a nuclear Iran, despite fears to the contrary, is not likely to behave very differently from other existing nuclear weapon states. Finally, coming to the catch-22 situation that Iran finds itself, I would like to end this presentation by highlighting on a problem or a question which has been munching over. Fact one, Iran has the capability to develop nuclear weapons, one which is widely accepted. The debate is generally centered on how Iran would develop a breakout capability. Security concerns Iran does have, the concerns like Israel's possession of nuclear weapons, Iran's relations with the US, and these have the capabilities, like I brought out before, to drive Iran's pursuit of nuclear weapons. The problem, and therefore the question is this: Iran is definitely heavily dependent on Russian and Chinese friendship to shore up itself economically and shield itself against the international diplomatic onslaught. Thus, it cannot afford to lose their support. This is understood. Learning from the treatment meted out to North Korea and Libya by the international community, Tehran understands that the US-led international community has different standards for nuclear haves and have-nots. Thus, Iranian nuclear capability would be credible to deter American or Israeli action only if it possibly tests, regardless of whether such a test is successful or unsuccessful, as seen from the DPR case. But if Iran tests, it loses, not only does it lose Russian and Chinese support, it will also result in severe international recriminations and loss, and thus a political decision will only occur if Iran feels that it is invulnerable against such pressures. So my question is the following: what does a nuclear Iran mean? Does it necessarily have to mean testing, or would something other than also would credibility demonstrate whether it's nuclear wherewithal? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Several points have arisen there, and before I ask a question which I have in my mind, is there anyone who wants to ask a question with regard to, yes, Casey? Just a question.
Yes,
yeah.
Just two issues. One is, you said IAE was taken for a ride by the Niger document. Baradai's book brings out very clearly that IAEA straight away said that this is fake, and Americans were not listening. It is Security Council which was taken for a ride, not IAEA. So there's a correction there. Secondly, don't pass, I think we tend to view Iran sentimentally as many other countries. Iran views no one sentimentally, nor should India. Therefore, to judge a country's intentions is even much more difficult than to judge individuals' intentions. Generally, a listing of whether Iran is risk-prone or risk-averse, there are three instances where they are risk-prone. There is the 19...
Casey, we'll come to the discussion where you can kindly make this very important point you're making. No. But if there are any questions with regard to something you didn't understand, please ask. I mean, is there anything that he said that you didn't...
No, I'm just contradicting a blanket...
Fair enough.
Giving of a character certificate to Iran that they are risk-averse. They are not.
Please make that point.
There are instances both sides.
Indeed so. But please make that point when we come to the discussion as a whole.
Sure.
Yeah.